like to welcome you back to the basic study. We're going to be going into our fifth segment now in this series. As we started from the very beginning, of course, the premise was as we came out of the book of Zechariah, chapter 14, and it talked about getting into that evening hour, that dark hour, and that in that dark hour there would be light. And as we've went through this, of course, the premise is that there have been many nations, just like the backdrop of this first opening slide, the fallen ruins of Greece. There have been many nations who have risen and fallen. And like each one of these first slides, I've had quotes from Greek philosophers of that time, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, each one of these guys, in a way, saw parts of the rise and the fall of their nations and are sharing with us little nuggets of gold that would have changed drastically their own area, their own time, if people had been paying attention. As Plato says here, good actions give strength to ourselves and inspire good actions in others. But what happens when you have a majority of the people who are choosing bad actions? How would you define good actions and bad actions? Of course, that in and of itself is a long study and very important. But on a very simple level, of course, good actions are those things that follow what Christ himself showed in his own life, in his own actions. And of course, bad actions are outside of that. Not all bad actions are evil. Not all bad actions are horrendous or terrible. Some of them just are not wisdom. In other words, we're choosing to do things that in the end probably are not going to get us to the happiness that we want. And so therefore, there are bad actions. We can honestly say they're bad actions, even sometimes scientifically or psychologically, they've already been looked into, and we can see that there's really no good outcome. Therefore, they're bad actions, even if they seem harmless and insignificant on the surface. And so we really need to pay a lot of attention to what Christ did, how he lived, how he was an example for the people around him. That's what this is about, being that light in a time of darkness. And so we've been starting every one of these slides, every one of these PowerPoints in John chapter 14, verse 6. It says, Jesus said unto them, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. And again, this is the premise. And just like in schooling, we have to continually repeat things. When we were in grade school, we repeated the alphabet over and over again until we had it memorized. And that's what this is about. It's about memorizing those little things that help us get onto the true path. So we have to remember Jesus Christ is the way. He's the example for us. We need to study his life. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 4 books of the Bible. If all we ever did was spend our time reading those 4 books, we would be so far advanced from most Christians today. And that's not to say that the rest of the scriptures is unimportant. It is all important. But just those 4 books, studying the life of Jesus Christ, seeing what he did every day in his life, that in and of itself would give us so far ahead of the average Joe, so to speak. He says he is the truth. And so from him comes truth, not from us. Truth is one of those things. It's like many of the truths that we saw in the first studies about nature, about the universe, the creation. Truths are those things that God created, not us. We just discover them. And so we discover Christ as one of our truths, and we discover his life and what he did, and we follow it. And there is no life outside of him. He is the life in every way. You know, as we studied, I think it was probably in the 3rd or 4th study, we looked at the composition of the human body and, you know, how science can break us right down to all the minerals, all the components, the earthly components that make up this body. And, you know, like a recipe, science can sit down and recreate. But what they can't do, they can't give life. They have not been able to, because that comes from God. And so, as Christ said, we don't get to the Father without going through Christ. That's the way. And then in John 8:32, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. In this world with so much problems, with so much disinformation, with so much fake news, the only place we can go to have true confidence is to Jesus. In him is the truth. And when we learn more and more of the truth, everything else begins to shed away, begins to fall away. The truth makes us free. And in a world of confusion, we sit tranquil because to us, everything's making sense or making more sense as we grow. And that's what this is about. It's about continuing to grow day by day in our life, building on the basics and achieving in our lives what Christ wanted us to achieve, to be good examples, to be faithful, and to be true. And so we've talked about the earth and the universe. We've talked about our body, our health, this being that we are. We've talked about the fingerprint of God, the evidence that it took a divine creator to create everything there is on this planet. Today, I want to get into true love. I want to look at the examples of love that Christ himself left for us, because I think that as we begin to explore that and the very basics of truths, we've got to start with love. Today, there's a lot of anger. In our time period, I'm recording this the 1st of February of 2021, there is a lot of anger. There's a lot of hatred. There's a lot of division. And we've got to figure out how to get back to love. Christ never once said, only love those people on your team. Only love those people who think like you, who are of your political leaning. He never said that, ever, anywhere. What he did say was love your neighbor as yourself. What he did say was to even love your enemy. Those are very difficult things in this challenging world, especially with so many emotionally gripping things happening. You know, when you get into difficult discussions like homosexuality or abortion or any one of those things, they can be emotionally gripping and tear our hearts apart, really. But nonetheless, we've got to be able to comprehend true love. We've got to look beyond those thoughts, those ideas, and look towards a better world. And so, in an unjust world, which is what I would say the Greeks were living in, all of these philosophers that I've been quoting from, they lived in an unjust world. In the time of Christ, when the Roman Empire was in power, they lived, the church, the first century church lived very much in an unjust world. Everything that we can imagine today, the worst things that exist in our environment, no matter where we live today, existed in the Roman Empire and in reality in every one of the empires that we've talked about. The Babylonian Empire, the Medes and Persians Empire, which may have been actually the best out of all of these empires, but it still had a lot of bad in it. The Greek Empire, each one of these had evil, including the Israelite Empire. And that's one of the reasons why God destroyed each and every one of them, because they became so unjust, nothing could survive. And so, if we don't want to lose the world that we live in, we need to understand how to have love and kindness in an unjust world. And so I want to start looking at several things that Christ himself did and just kind of thinking about these things, putting them in our mind from the context of being in an unjust world. Because as I said, Jesus walked in an unjust world. The Romans didn't just crucify Jesus and two thieves. They were not the only people crucified. From that time period, historians tell us that there were literally hundreds, maybe even thousands of people crucified. A very unjust world. Today, life imprisonment, even for an unjust person, is wonderful comparatively. I mean, granted, crucifixion was, done and over with in a short time, where being in prison for life is not done and over with in a short time. But nonetheless, I would say, as far as our physical body's concerned, being in prison is far milder than dying on a cross. And Christ was not the only one. And that's not to diminish the sacrifice that he did. His sacrifice was extraordinary, especially because he was so innocent, so perfect, so loving, so kind in everything to everyone. And even on the cross, he was still loving. And that to me is our example. So let's look through these various passages about the life of Christ and just see how he reached out to people in the unjust world that he lived in. Mark chapter 8, verses 20 through to 26. And he came to Bethsaida, and they bring a blind man unto him, and besought him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of town. And when he had spit on his eyes and put his hands upon him, he asked him if he saw aught. And he looked up and said, I see men as trees walking. After that, he put his hands again upon his eyes and made him look up, and he was restored, and saw every man clearly. And he sent him away to his house, saying, Neither go into town, nor tell it to any in the town. And so here we have Jesus walking along. The people come along, and they bring in a blind man, and they expect him to fix the problem. They didn't, according to the text, we don't see them coming and asking. We don't see them coming and, in some way making this a nice situation, more or less. What I see in this text, and maybe I see it all wrong, but I'm looking at it from the context of the world that Jesus was walking in part, historically. They just come up and they expect him, heal this man. And Jesus does it. He spits in the man's eyes, puts his hands on it, and cures him of his blindness. What did this man deserve? Did he deserve to be cured? Who was he? We don't really know anything about him. A random connection in the street? Chances are there wasn't anything random about it. Not too much in Jesus' life probably was. But from the context of the story, we just have this gentleman coming up who's blind, and Jesus heals his eyes. And I think that's remarkable. I think it's remarkable to think about. We continue on into Mark chapter 6, verses 37 through 44. He answered and said unto them, Give ye them to eat. And they say unto him, Shall we go and buy 200 penny worth of bread and give them to eat? He saith unto them, How many loaves have ye? Go and see. And when they knew, they say 5 and 2 fish. And he commanded them to make all sit down by the companies upon the green grass. And they sat down in ranks by hundreds and by 50s. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, he looked up to heaven and blessed and brake the loaves, and gave them to the disciples to set before them. And the 2 fishes divided he among all of them. And they did all eat, and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments of the fishes. And they did eat of the loaves, and they that did eat of the loaves were about 5,000 men. So, here we have the disciples, Jesus, they're out preaching the gospel. Out of the blue, they've got a crowd of people. What it tells us in this particular passage is there was about 5,000 men. How many women? How many children? Young people? There could easily have been 10,000, maybe even upwards of 12 to 15,000 people present at this moment. We don't really know. The only number it gives us is that there was about 5,000 men. Jesus breaks the bread. Jesus breaks up the fish and feeds the multitude. Why? Was there any reason why he should have done that? We think about the context of our own lives. And oftentimes when we decide to help someone, there's probably some motivation behind it. Even if it's just giving money to some poor person alongside of the road, there's usually a motivation. And so we're always asking the question, why? Why did Jesus do this? Why do we do what we do? Think about that, because that to me is important when we're trying to get back to the basics. Jesus, in a very unkind world, in a very unjust world, reached out in what I would say, obviously in this particular instance, he's breaking bread and breaking fish. that didn't necessarily cost him anything. But nonetheless, this is a huge expense, feeding all these people, taking the time to feed them all. There was no advantage to Jesus in this moment. I mean, this was a wonderful miracle, and all these people, I'm sure, were shocked and went home marveling. But when we get to the book of Acts and we see how many people were actually steadfast believers, we find this minuscule number. Where were these 5,000 people with their wives and kids? Not there. They were here for probably just the food. They were probably, in today's terms, people looking for a welfare handout. So why'd Jesus give it to them? That's an important question. If we're going to understand the true love and kindness that we need to achieve in a world that does not deserve it at all, then we've got to comprehend why. Why did Jesus do this? Why did he bless these people? And I can't say I have answers for all these things, but I think that in these stories are answers for our lives today, because I think we live in a world almost identical. Matthew chapter 17, verse 14 through 18. And when they were come to the multitude, there came to him a certain man, kneeling down to him, and saying, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is a lunatic, and sore vexed. For oft times he falleth into the fire, oft into the water. And I brought him to thy disciples, and they could not cure him. Then Jesus answered and said, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? And how long shall I suffer you? Bring him hither to me. And Jesus rebuked the devil, and he departed out of him, and the child was cured from that very hour. And so we have this wonderful story, again, casting out this demon. And the story in and of itself is tremendously wonderful, a blessing extraordinary. But in verse 17, we see a little bit about the culture, the time period. Faithless and perverse generation. He's speaking of the people around him. Yet, did he send them away unblessed? They were a faithless and perverse generation. He said, how long must I suffer with you? And yet, did he not help them? And I think there's a powerful lesson in this. As we look at the world today, especially when we're talking politics, which is probably the most supercharged issue in the world, but religion comes in vastly, quite quickly in a second place there as supercharged and emotional. But the questions are, how do we deal with these other people? How do we suffer them? Maybe they are a perverse generation. Maybe they are doing evil things. But how did Jesus respond? Now, that doesn't mean that he was approving of all of their perversities or their faithlessness or anything, but he did reach out and he left a blessing. And I think that's pretty awesome as an example to ourselves. I know too often in my own heart, when I see the perverseness of our generation, it doesn't leave me wanting to leave a blessing on anyone. But yet this is the moment to shine. Remember, it's the time for the light to shine in the darkness. John chapter 11, verse 33 through 43. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping, which came with her, he groaned in his spirit and was troubled, and said, Where have you laid him? They said unto him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. Then said the Jews, Behold, how he loved him. And some of them said, Could not this man, which opened the eyes of the blind, have caused that even this man should not have died? And so, this is the story, obviously, of Lazarus's death. And we can see here, the people are coming to Jesus, but they're already accusing Jesus. Jesus is the reason Lazarus is dead. He didn't save him. Think about that for a minute. Now, we don't really know what Lazarus died of. Chances are, because it seems like it was somewhat sudden, that it may have been some kind of a disease or who knows what. But anyway, they assumed Jesus could have saved his life. And so they're already coming to Jesus accusing him in their hearts. He could have saved him, but he didn't. He didn't even save his best friend, so to speak. What would that make you want to do? And yet Jesus comes and he blesses Lazarus. Continuing in verse 38 through 43, Jesus therefore again groaning in himself cometh to the grave. It was a cave, and a stone lay upon it. Jesus said, Take away the stone. Martha, the sister of him that was dead, said, Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he hath been dead 4 days. And I think this is unique and interesting in the sense that Martha and the rest of the disciples, they walked with Jesus every day. They saw the miracles he could do. They saw the dividing up of the bread and the fishes. They saw so many things that he did. And what did they really believe? Did they believe these were parlor tricks? Did they believe that these were just sleight of hand? Because obviously, if he can break bread, if he can break fish, if he can bless all these people, cast out these demons, why couldn't he resurrect a dead man? But yet they didn't think he could. He's been dead. He smells. You're the reason why he's dead. You didn't save him. Jesus said unto her, Said I not unto thee that if thou wouldest believe, thou shouldest see the glory of God? There is no faith, not even in his people. 41, Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead was laid. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me. And I knew that thou heardest me always. But because of the people which stand by, I said it, that they may believe that thou hast sent me. And when he thus spoke, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And when I say they didn't have faith, that isn't to say that there weren't some there with some faith, or that even all of them didn't have some, but they didn't really have the faith. They didn't really believe. They saw what Jesus did. They heard what he preached. They liked it. They liked being with him. It was a pleasure to be with him. Of course, if you were from a bad part of town, Jesus wasn't doing bad things. And so you had a peaceful time. And what he did was good. It felt good. And yet, they had a hard time believing. But Jesus still blessed them. Matthew 8:14 through 17. And when Jesus was come into Peter's house, he saw his wife's mother laid and sick of a fever. And he touched her hand, and the fever left her. And she arose. Excuse me. And he touched her hand, and the fever left her. And she arose and ministered unto them. When the even was come, they brought him unto him many that were possessed with devils. And he cast out the spirits with his word, and healed all that were sick, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, Himself took our infirmities and bare our sickness. And so we think about this. A faithless and a perverse generation, people that didn't believe, even Jesus' own people, they didn't believe, they couldn't believe, and yet he takes our infirmities. He bears our sickness. He blesses us despite all of that. And I just think there's something to learn there. Matthew chapter 9, verse 20 and 22 through 22. And behold, a woman which was diseased with an issue of blood 12 years came behind him and touched him, the hem of his garment. For she said within herself, If I may but touch his garment, I shall be whole. But Jesus turned him about. And when he saw her, he said, Daughter, be of good comfort. Thy faith hath made thee whole. And the woman was made whole from that hour. And again, we have another issue. Here she comes up. She literally, in all the text, is portrayed as sneaking up and touching the hem of his garment, almost specifically so he doesn't know. Obviously, under the Jewish laws, she has an issue of blood, is what this would be called. And anybody who touches anybody with an issue of blood has to go through rites of purification. And so I suspect in some sense she was feeling like if she could sneak up and touch him and, who knows, get some blessing. She's already spent her fortune her own life savings and trying to get healed and couldn't get healed from anything. If she could just touch him and get a blessing, if he doesn't know, maybe he doesn't have to go through the rite of purification. And so she comes up and touches him, but Jesus blesses her. She didn't come asking. She didn't come with politeness. She didn't come in all the ways that we would think a good person should do it. Imagine just for a moment a similar circumstance, albeit different. Someone walks up to your house, your tool room is open, they come in and they borrow your tools, they use them, and they bring them back and replace them. Trying to do it without you knowing. But while they have the tools in their possession, you come home, you find all your tools missing, and you think you've been robbed blind. Okay? This is very similar to what's happening in this situation. She's sneaking up and touching Jesus and trying to take, without asking, without permission, a blessing. Of course, he still blesses her. He doesn't accuse her. He doesn't ridicule her. He doesn't cast her aside. He says, "Thy faith hath made thee whole." And she was healed from that hour forward. And I think there's a lot we can learn in these stories. Mark chapter 5, verse 2 through 17. Very powerful story here. "And when he was come out of the ship, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who had his dwelling among the tombs. And no man could bind him, no, not with chains, because he had been oft bound with fetters and chains. And the chains had been plucked asunder by him, and the fetters broken in pieces. Neither could any man tame him. And always, day and night, he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying and cutting himself with stones." And so we have this man who is possessed. And Jesus comes, he gets out of the boat, and here is this man possessed. Many people have tried to chain this man up. Many people have tried to imprison him. He breaks loose out of everything. And he's always free, and he's a problem. Day and night, he's in the tombs, he's crying, he's cutting himself, he's throwing stones. I'm sure any passerbys of that area are getting spooked. They're probably getting stones thrown at them. He's probably coming out and cursing them, maybe even coming out and chasing people that are walking by. Obviously, it would have made it difficult for anyone to come along and do a burial in among these tombs. And so the important thing here is Jesus steps out, and here is this guy that no one else has been able to do anything about. Verse 6, "But when he saw Jesus afar off, he ran and worshipped him, and cried with a loud voice, and said, What have I to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of the Most High God? I adjure thee by God, that thou torment me not. For he said unto him, Come out of the man, thou unclean spirit. And he asked him, What is thy name? And he answered, saying, My name is Legion, for we are many. And he besought him much that he would not send them away out of the country. Now there was there, nigh unto the mountains, a great herd of swine feeding. And all the devils besought him, saying, Send us into the swine, that we may enter into them. And forthwith Jesus gave them leave. And the unclean spirits went out and entered into the swine. And the herd ran violently down a steep place into the sea. It was about 2,000. And they were choked in the sea. And they that fed the swine fled.